Picture this. It's September 1814. The rain lashing against your face isn't just a late summer storm. It is an apocalyptic deluge. A freezing, relentless sheet of water that binds the midnight air with the stinging, acrid reek of burnt sulfur, wet wool, and raw, suffocating panic. Just 50 miles away, the proud new capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., is nothing but a smoking graveyard of blackened timber. The presidential mansion has been torched to ash, its glowing embers hissing in the torrential downpour. And now, the absolute largest armada the British Empire has ever assembled has turned its gun sights directly on you. From across the black, churning waters of the Patapsco River, the night sky violently splits open in a terrifying scream of exploding iron. Thousands of heavy mortar shells plunge from the heavens with deafening roars, shaking the very mud beneath your boots to its core. At the helm of this floating apocalypse is British Admiral George Cockburn. He doesn't just want a tactical military victory. He is driven by sheer, unadulterated vengeance. He has publicly promised to reduce your home to cinders, to wipe its very existence off the map, and to leave nothing but a charred, bloody scar on the American coastline. We've all been spoon-fed the sanitized, polite textbook version of this night. We know the tidy myth of the lone poet on a wooden boat, watching a flag magically survive the dawn. We've sung the dry anthem 1,000 times, but what about the living, breathing, terrified metropolis trapped just outside the walls of that fort? What did the air actually taste like when an empire swore to erase your life? Welcome to Chronicles of Time. Today, we are throwing away the polite history books. We are stepping directly into the treacherous, knee-deep mud of the fastest-growing, most cosmopolitan, and most universally hated city in North America. A booming cauldron of 45,000 souls, ready to either fight to the death or burn. This is the untold visceral truth of 1814 Baltimore. To understand why an empire was driven insane with rage, we first have to look at the bizarre, multi-headed monster of a city that history almost forgot. Let's pull back from the exploding harbor for a moment and look at the ground you are actually standing on. If you expected the orderly, rational grid of Philadelphia or the planned permanence of a European capital, 1814 Baltimore would strike you as a terrifying urban fever dream. This was not a neatly organized, civilized town. It was a lawless, multi-headed beast. In 1729, it began as a single, sleepy tobacco landing on the west side of the Jones Falls, a tiny speculative settlement carved out of the dense wilderness. But by the time the British Armada arrived, it had exploded into a sprawling monster, violently swallowing up its neighbors to become the third largest metropolis in the United States. It grew not by rational design or careful urban planning, but by a chaotic, aggressive gold rush of land and water. The city was actually 3 separate, fiercely competitive and often hostile settlements forced into an uneasy marriage: Old Baltimore Town, Jonestown, and Fells Point. Because this boomtown expanded faster than any law, surveyor, or map could regulate, the physical topography here is a study in jarring, violent contradictions. As you slog down the main thoroughfares, you aren't walking on elegant paved brick sidewalks. You are wading through a treacherous, knee-deep river of unpaved sludge. In the brutal summer heat, it bakes into a blinding, choking dust. In the autumn downpours, it turns into a liquid trap where heavy carriage wheels sink straight down to their wooden axles. Look up from the mire, and the landscape hits you like a physical blow. Towering, elegant brick mansions belonging to millionaire merchants stand shoulder to shoulder with rotting wooden shanties and rough-hewn log cabins. There is no zoning, no velvet rope, and no spatial discipline separating the ultra-rich from the desperately poor. Even at night, the infrastructure shocks the foreign traveler. The city doesn't slip into total darkness, but fractures under the eerie, flickering amber glow of whale oil street lamps, a rare luxury introduced just a few decades prior that barely pierces the swampy gloom. By all rational logic, this poorly governed, mud-choked bog hole should have remained an irrelevant colonial outpost on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay. If the physical layout of Baltimore was an unmapped, chaotic sprawl, its human landscape was a hypervolatile powder keg sitting on a drastically short fuse. By the autumn of 1814, this wasn't just a typical quiet American harbor town, it was a swirling, aggressively cosmopolitan crucible. It was a place where staggering old-world fortunes collided violently with a desperate, traumatized flood of global refugees. Stand at the bustling intersection of Gay and Baltimore streets on a humid morning, and the sheer acoustic velocity of the crowd will knock you back. You are immediately bombarded by a dense, aggressive sonic tapestry. You hear the deep guttural bark of high German tradesmen mixing with the sharp, rhythmic Scots-Irish lilt of backcountry teamsters. You catch the lyrical, rapid-fire French of aristocratic refugees and free people of color who had just narrowly escaped the apocalyptic fires of the Haitian Revolution. And underneath it all, the quiet, rhythmic West African dialects of the city's massive, essential black labor force. At the absolute pinnacle of this fragile social pyramid sat the ultra-wealthy Anglo-Irish and Presbyterian merchant elites. These were the merchant princes, men who built sprawling palatial country estates and governed the city's trade with an iron aristocratic hand. But right beneath their polished leather boots was an exploding population of the middling sort, fiercely independent shipwrights, tanners, copper-rolling smiths, and roughneck dock-caulkers. In Baltimore, unlike the rigid, frozen hierarchies of London or Paris, an ambitious man with a dangerous trade and a ruthless streak could climb from absolute grinding poverty to breathtaking wealth in a single season. This extreme, hyper-accelerated social mobility made the city a magnetic beacon for the boldest, most desperate souls on Earth. These deeply polarized classes fundamentally distrusted and frequently hated one another, split by vicious tribalism and radical politics. But here is the catch. They might have been ready to kill each other over class differences in the muddy streets, but they were completely, inextricably chained together by a single, dark, and hyper-profitable illegal industry. An industry that funded their arrogant swagger, and one that struck absolute, paralyzing fear into the heart of the entire globe. To see the literal engine house of Baltimore's explosive fortunes and the source of its terrifying global reputation, you must leave the muddy residential avenues behind and head straight down to the deep-water shoreline of Fells Point. If the rest of the city felt chaotic, Fells Point felt downright dangerous. This was a brutal, industrial theater where the fresh scent of sawn-white oak and sweet cedar mixed with the sticky, suffocating reek of boiling pine tar and wet hemp ropes. Walk along the packed, slippery wooden wharves, and your eyes are immediately drawn to a marvel of maritime engineering, slicing cleanly through the brackish water, the Baltimore Clipper. These weren't standard clunky cargo vessels. They were lethal, razor-thin schooners built for pure, blinding speed. They boasted massive, raked masts that spread an absolute ocean of canvas to trap the slightest breeze. The most legendary among them, the heavily armed 356-ton chasseur, known to history as the Pride of Baltimore, was a literal weapon of total economic warfare. Most sanitized history textbooks will tell you that piracy died out in the Caribbean a century earlier. But in 1814, Baltimore actively resurrected it as a highly commercialized, state-sanctioned corporate gold rush. Under official government letters of marque, The wealthy merchants and roughneck mariners of this harbor didn't just fight for survival. They engaged in highly organized, legalized ocean hijacking. Nearly 1/5 of Baltimore's adult male population became legal pirates, relentlessly hunting down wealthy British merchant fleet across the globe. They captured over 500 British vessels, bleeding the world's greatest empire of $16 million in prize money and driving the elite underwriters at Lloyd's of London completely insane with financial panic. This astronomical influx of stolen wealth didn't just line the pockets of elite investors. It filtered down directly into the calloused hands of ordinary caulkers, sailors, and smiths. It transformed simple artisans into an aggressive, untouchable class of cash-flush rebels who suddenly had more gold than they knew how to spend. But wealth alone doesn't buy the kind of insane, suicidal courage required to stand on a muddy hill and face the heavy cannons of the Royal Navy. How did a mob of undisciplined pirates find the sheer audacity to defy a global superpower? The answer wasn't in their wallets. To find it, we have to look directly at what was sitting on their dinner plates. To truly comprehend why the citizens of Baltimore possessed the insane audacity to stand up and defy the world's most formidable military empire, you have to look past the high-minded political speeches. You have to look directly at what was sitting on their dinner plates. If the tar-stained docks of Fells Point served as the city's explosive economic engine, then Center Market, known affectionately and mockingly to locals as the Marsh Market, was its literal, pulsing gut. Running right along the water's edge, this was the longest, most aggressively overflowing outdoor food market in the entire American Republic. It was a dense, chaotic forest of covered wooden stalls and brick sheds where the sheer, offensive abundance of food routinely moved foreign travelers to actual tears of envy. Think about the global context of 1814. In the wretched, smog-choked slums of London or the war-ravaged streets of Paris, the working-class poor survived on moldy gray rye bread, grimy cabbage leaves, and heavily watered-down gin. But here in Baltimore, even a modest dock caulker, a simple blacksmith, or a runaway apprentice ate like an absolute king. Walk through the market stalls, and you would see heavy wooden tables groaning under massive, bloody sides of prime beef, towering mountains of fresh pork, and endless rows of wild game birds hanging from heavy iron hooks. There was seafood so unbelievably fresh, it was still swimming in the depths of the Chesapeake Bay just 2 hours prior. Shimmering silver shade, gargantuan sturgeon, and massive piles of blue crabs and fat oysters, the literal size of a horse's hoof. This unprecedented, hyperabundant caloric engine was the hidden, biological fuel of the upcoming battle. History books love to focus on abstract philosophy, but desperate defenses are rarely fought successfully by starving, exhausted peasants. The ordinary citizens of Baltimore did not feel like vulnerable colonists clinging to the edge of a wild, untamed frontier. They felt like prosperous, highly civilized masters of their own destiny. When you have a full stomach of roasted beef, a dry roof over your head, and a pocket violently jingling with silver coin from a morning's privateer trade, you possess the ultimate psychological luxury. You have the sheer physical energy to stand in a public tavern and genuinely believe you can kill a king. But beneath this glittering veneer of wealth, full bellies, and unified defiance, a terrifying internal rot was actively festering. Sunrise in 1814. Baltimore is not a gentle, quiet affair. There are no modern alarm clocks here, but you absolutely do not need them. At exactly 5 a.m, the deep, resonant vibration of church bells and the distant, bone-rattling thud of the morning gun from Fort McHenry signals that the locked and loaded city is completely awake. Almost instantly, Baltimore's unique percussion starts. It is a deafening clatter of heavy, iron-rimmed wagon wheels striking uneven cobblestones and rough timber roads. It is a rhythmic, teeth-chattering sound that heralds the start of the frantic workday in the busiest, most rebellious port town on the Atlantic coast. As you swing open your heavy wooden front door, the morning air hits you like a physical barrier. It is a total shock to the human nervous system. This is not the clean, pine-scented breeze of the Maryland backcountry. It is a thick, swampy soup of highly volatile smells. First comes the sharp, acrid bite of wood smoke from 10,000 cooking fires. Then, the heavy organic stench of horse manure deposited daily by the thousands of beasts that serve as the metropolis's only land engines. On a warm September day, the breeze off the Patapsco River brings zero relief. It carries a salty, fishy, brackish odor of rotting dock timber, wet hemp, and stagnant marsh water. The streets are already an immersive theater of sound. You cannot walk a single block without hearing the constant metallic ting-ting-ting echoing from nearby shipyards and blacksmith alleys. There is the heavy, rhythmic chant of colonial street cries. "Oysters! Fat oysters!" screams a woman, pushing a wooden cart fresh from the harbor docks. "Charcoal! Charcoal!" bellows a soot-covered boy dodging through heavy traffic. Everywhere is rapid, relentless, frantic, kinetic movement. You are constantly brushing shoulders with wealthy merchants in fine silk waistcoats, roughneck sailors in torn canvas trousers, and weary slaves carrying heavy cargo. But while the main streets vibrate with this everyday chaos, a much darker, much deadlier symphony is being orchestrated in the city's hidden alleys, one that threatens to tear Baltimore apart from the inside out before the British even fire a single shot. But while the main streets vibrate with everyday commerce, a much darker, much deadlier symphony is being orchestrated in the city's hidden alleys. There is a comforting, highly seductive myth in American history that the War of 1812 was a period of flawless, unanimous patriotism, that every single man, woman, and child in Baltimore stood shoulder to shoulder on their muddy doorsteps, cheering defiantly as the British ships approached. The reality is far messier, bloodier, and infinitely more dangerous. In the autumn of 1814, Baltimore was not just a city preparing for an external siege by a foreign empire. It was a deeply divided powder keg actively at war with itself. Long before the first British sails crept up the Chesapeake Bay, these neat brick thoroughfares ran red with the blood of internal political terrorism. This city had earned a terrifying, well-deserved nickname across the young republic, Mobtown. Step into a dark side alley off Charles Street, and the sensory landscape immediately transforms from commercial prosperity into paranoid dread. You can almost hear the sudden, terrifying crash of shattering glass and the splintering of heavy oak doors. The air carries the acrid, choking smell of burning paper as political printing shops are systematically ransacked and torched by angry mobs. In the brutal riots that erupted just 2 years earlier, a radical pro-war faction had targeted Federalists who dared to criticize the conflict with Britain. They did not just smash printing presses. They violently rounded up political dissidents, including legendary, aging Revolutionary War heroes, and tortured them in the streets, beating them relentlessly and dripping boiling wax onto their faces. By 1814, that deep, partisan terror still paralyzes the metropolitan heart. Neighbors look at one another with narrow, suspicious eyes from behind locked wooden shutters, constantly listening for whispers of traitors, spies, and executioners lurking in the tavern shadows. This was a brutal, undeclared civil war disguised as national defense. Yet, while these political factions violently clashed over loyalty to the federal government, a massive, entirely unrepresented population living in the literal shadows of the city's grand brick row houses was waiting for the perfect moment to ask a much more dangerous question. As the word liberty echoes proudly across the harbor and filters through the wealthy merchant row houses, it collides violently with a brutal, stomach-turning reality. Just blocks away from where prosperous shipwrights blast defiant shouts of sailors' rights and celebrate their newfound privateer fortunes, a chillingly different sound breaks through the morning fog. It is the heavy metallic clink of literal iron chains. This is the absolute moral paradox of 1814 Baltimore. In a city fiercely risking total annihilation to defend its sovereign freedom from a foreign emperor, human beings are still being actively bought, sold, and worked to death like standard marketplace cattle. According to colonial tax records, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children live trapped inside the metropolis. They are the invisible, entirely unrepresented hands keeping this booming, rebellious engine running. Look closer at the busy Patapsco docks, and you will see enslaved laborers hauling the very bags of fine white flour that enrich the Anglo-Irish elite. They are the domestic servants quietly scrubbing marble steps, the laborers boiling toxic pine tar in the sweltering shipyards, and the master craftsmen secretly turning the gears of white wealth. Yet, Baltimore's paradox runs even deeper. While it operates as a major brutal hub for the domestic slave trade, it simultaneously contains the largest free black urban community in the entire United States. Amidst the terrifying shadow of human bondage, a vibrant, resilient black institutional life is aggressively carving out spaces for survival. Free black caulkers, tanners, and brilliant entrepreneurs navigate these treacherous, unpaved streets daily. They skillfully weaponize the war's own anti-tyrannical rhetoric to build independent churches, thriving schools, and underground safety networks. For them, the year 1814 isn't an abstract, high-minded political debate over shipping taxes. It is a literal life-or-death test of whether the American experiment is a cruel, mocking joke or a genuine promise of universal liberation. This suffocating moral weight hangs over the city as heavily as the swampy summer humidity. But as dusk falls over these deeply fractured neighborhoods, the social friction shifts indoors, into the smoky, candle-lit rooms where the city's final, desperate gamble would be decided over a bottle of alcohol. As the autumn dusk settles over these fractured, paranoid neighborhoods, the desperate heart of Baltimore's resistance retreats from the muddy streets into the warm, flickering light of its local taverns. Places like the Indian Queen on Baltimore Street become the literal, social, and political nervous system of a city waiting to ignite. Push open the heavy timber door of a crowded taproom in early September, and the sensory overload is intoxicating. The air inside is a thick, humid cloud of heavy tobacco smoke, roasting beef, stale ale, and the sweet, rich aroma of expensive Madeira wine. Guttering tallow candles cast long, dancing shadows across wood-paneled walls, illuminating the frantic, sweat-streaked faces of the city's unlikely defenders. Men are slamming their heavy pewter tankards onto grease-stained tables, screaming over the deafening din, arguing about British troop movements. It is a chaotic world where the grand strategy to save the young American nation is being drawn up by men who are, truth be told, frequently slightly drunk. In these dark, smoky rooms, an ultra-wealthy merchant prince brushes shoulders with a free black shipyard caulker, completely unified by a raw, survivalist desperation. Here, Senator-turned-General Samuel Smith engineers a desperate logistical miracle. Bypassing slow federal bureaucracy, Smith masterfully orchestrates the rapid mobilization of 10,000 ordinary citizens. Tailors, shoemakers, and mariners grab heavy iron shovels and march eastward toward the high ridge of Hampstead Hill. Through the long, grueling nights, fueled by rum and sheer terror, They dig tirelessly into the hard clay. Soft palms are split, fine silk coats are caked in dark Maryland mud, and deep class divisions permanently disappear into the trenches. But no amount of mud can stop what comes next. On September 13th, the British fleet finally opens fire. For 25 straight hours, your entire world becomes nothing but a blinding, deafening sheet of fire and screaming iron rain. You lie silently in your shallow trench as massive mortar shells obliterate the earth around you. The ground violently heaves. The sky bleeds a sickly red. As midnight approaches, the bombardment reaches a terrifying, apocalyptic crescendo. The protective walls of Fort McHenry completely vanish under a thick blanket of black smoke and fire. Hope does not just fade, it is violently snuffed out in the darkness. The nest of pirates is finally burning, and it seems all is truly lost. You lie silently in the muddy trench as the endless, agonizing night finally begins to fracture. For 25 straight hours you have endured a deafening sheet of fire. But as the morning of September 14th slowly dawns, the heavy, suffocating clouds of acrid white gunpowder smoke begin to lift over the cold waters of the Patapsco River. Through the hazy, ghost-like morning mist, a sudden, completely unexpected, and breathtaking visual shock catches your eye. It is not a burning ruin. It is a massive, defiant 30 by 42-foot garrison flag, catching the early autumn wind high above the battered ramparts of Fort McHenry. Almost instantly, a thunderous, collective roar of pure, unadulterated euphoria erupts across the mud-soaked trenches of Hampstead Hill. It echoes from the crowded taverns of Baltimore Street to the tar-slicked shipyards of Fells Point. This rowdy, violent, politically fractured nest of pirates did not just survive, it broke the momentum of the world's most formidable empire. This single dawn permanently altered the raw soul of a young republic, transforming a lawless boomtown into the proud monumental city. The wild spirit of resistance that filled these unpaved streets was captured by a local poet, birthing a timeless national anthem. Yet, the true DNA of America, chaotic, divided, but fiercely unbreakable when the fire comes, was forged right here in the mud of 1814 Baltimore. Thanks for surviving this visceral journey with us at Chronicles of Time. If you loved stepping into the gritty, untold shadows of history, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell us in the comments, what forgotten city should we digitally resurrect next? Untold history is waiting. See you in the trenches.